He became a king, though he never sought the throne. He fought in the Holy Land, though he could have ruled peacefully from London. He was respected even by Saladin, and his death marked the beginning of a legend. Today we will tell the story of a man whose name became a synonym for bravery, Richard the Lionheart. In this video you will learn why Richard betrayed his own father, how he found himself at the very center of the Third Crusade, why Jerusalem never yielded to him, yet glory still remained his, and why his heart was buried apart from his body. But most importantly, you will see how this man became a legend. Richard the Lionheart, knight, king, warrior, and the symbol of an entire era. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Bedtime stories appear here every day. Born for the throne, childhood, and the Plantagenet dynasty. On September 8, 1157, in the royal palace at Oxford, a boy was born who was destined to enter history under the name Richard the Lionheart. He became the third surviving son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who matched her husband in ambition, character, and influence. His birth did not cause political sensation. The heir was considered to be his elder brother, Henry the young king, and no one yet knew what role the younger Richard would play in the fate of the empire. But the blood that flowed through his veins united two mighty dynasties. His father, ruler of the Angevin dynasty, bore the titles King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His mother, Duchess of Aquitaine, was a woman of exceptional power and learning, once Queen of France, then Queen of England. As her dowry, she had brought her husband vast lands in the south of France, making him ruler of a vast Anglo-Norman empire stretching from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. Richard was born into a family where politics was inseparable from personal feeling. Henry II was known for his harsh temper and cold calculation, while Eleanor was marked by her independence, sharp mind, and determination to take part in governance. Their union, bound by politics, was full of conflicts and hidden rivalry. It was in such an atmosphere that the future heirs, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, were formed. The eldest, Henry the young king, received a crown during his father's lifetime, but not true power. Geoffrey became Duke of Brittany. John was given no lands, earning him the nickname Lackland, and Richard seemed destined to settle for the role of ruler of Aquitaine. The future king's childhood passed not in England, but in France, mainly in Anjou and Aquitaine. From an early age, he absorbed the spirit of the southern lands. Proud, independent, and musical, these regions were famed for chivalric traditions, troubadours, songs of love and valor, as well as the complex relations between lords and vassals. Eleanor, who knew these lands well, put much effort into helping her son master their customs and learn how to rule them. Richard's education included not only knightly training but also humanistic knowledge. He studied Latin, history, theology, learned to compose poetry in the Occitan language, and to play musical instruments. At the same time, he began early training in warfare, fencing, horseback riding, and archery. All of this was part of the mandatory upbringing of a prince destined to govern lands and possibly to lead armies. A special role in Richard's life from early years was played by his mother. Even after Eleanor fell into her husband's disfavor and was placed under virtual house arrest, she still retained influence over her southern domains. Richard, given into her care, became her favorite son, and it was to her that he owed much of his understanding of power, his culture, and his sense of personal dignity. Eleanor did everything to prepare him for rule in Aquitaine. Soon he was already seen as the future duke of those lands. When Richard was 12 years old, his father formally granted him the title Duke of Aquitaine. This gesture was not only an expression of trust, but also part of Henry II's complex political game, as he tried to balance the ambitions of his sons while keeping control of their lands. In reality, the young duke received not authority but duties, pacifying local barons, suppressing uprisings, and building relations with difficult vassals. For Richard, this became a true school of governance. He learned not from books, but from life. Chronicles mention that as a teenager he took part in suppressing a baronial revolt at Saints. There he first encountered betrayal and the unreliability of allies, and learned that military valor was only part of power. Politics required flexibility, patience, and calculation. These experiences taught him caution and resilience early. At the same time, his talent as poet and singer developed. Many contemporaries noted that Richard mastered the art of composing and performing songs no worse than professional troubadours. One of these songs, written much later during his captivity, has survived to our day and bears witness to his poetic gift and inner depth. This side of Richard, the rare combination of warrior and poet, added to his charm and made him especially popular among the knightly class. By the age of 15, Richard was already a mature youth, tall, stately, with reddish hair and a piercing gaze. He was respected for his martial skills, for his decisiveness, and for his frankness. He was not inclined to diplomatic politeness and preferred to speak his mind. This made an impression, especially against the backdrop of court intrigue and duplicity that reigned in Henry II's court. While his elder brother Henry, the young king, received empty titles and took part in ceremonies, Richard in practice learned to govern an unruly province. It was here, in southern France, that he gained independence, realized his own strength, and began to see his destiny not as a secondary prince but as a leader. By the time he reached majority, he was no longer viewed as a younger brother. He was Duke of Aquitaine, at least nominally, and a man whose opinion could not be ignored. His future was beginning to take shape, and inside him, the growing sense of destiny was preparing for its first open clash with his father. The rebel prince, struggle against father and brothers. In the second half of the 12th century, the empire of Henry II Plantagenet seemed strong and unshakable, but behind its facade cracks were already forming. The king, who held England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine under his control, dreamed of a stable dynastic succession. Yet he himself had planted the seed of discord in his family. He believed that if each son was given a title and part of the lands, but not full authority, they could be balanced against each other. But he underestimated their ambitions, and the force with which each of them longed to be more than a prince in his father's shadow. In 1170, Henry had his eldest son, Henry the young king, crowned during his lifetime, not in order to transfer power, but more as a gesture of political symbolism. This decision only worsened tensions. The young king had a crown but no income or real governance, and Henry II, still controlling all the key territories, was in no hurry to yield anything from his vast domains. In these circumstances, 3 years later, the first major rebellion against the king broke out. Its instigators were 3 of his sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, supported by their mother Eleanor of Aquitaine. The cause of the revolt was the sons' desire to receive their share of authority, and their dissatisfaction that their father was preparing to grant lands to the youngest, John, while giving nothing to the others. Eleanor, alarmed at the infringement of her elder son's rights and John's growing influence, supported the rebellion and tried to escape her husband's custody, but was captured on the way and imprisoned, where she would remain for many years. Richard, in this uprising, acted mainly within Aquitaine. He was already recognized as duke and regarded these lands as his rightful domain. He strengthened castles, gathered troops, and negotiated with local barons, promising them support and autonomy. At Poitiers, in the castle once ruled by his grandfather William X, he prepared for defense and relied on possible support from Paris. The French king, Louis VII, Eleanor's former husband, backed the rebels, seeking to weaken England's power in France. However, Henry II's campaign was resolute. He advanced with an army through Normandy and gradually began to crush the rebellion. He managed to secure the defection of barons to his side and took advantage of the rebels' poor organization. Richard, like his brothers, was forced to admit defeat and lay down arms. Henry, true to his pragmatic rule, forgave his sons, but it was a formal pardon. Eleanor remained imprisoned. John received lands, while the elder sons lost their hopes of independent power. After the rebellion, Richard returned to Aquitaine, but not as a rebel, as a royal representative. Henry II entrusted him with restoring order in the southern domains. Here Richard proved himself not only as a ruler but also as a stern commander. He suppressed uprisings with particular determination, punishing those who opposed him. Chronicles tell that in one episode he besieged a castle where disobedient vassals had taken refuge, and after their surrender he ordered it destroyed to the ground, to show that the Duke of Aquitaine intended to rule without weakness. Richard's harshness angered the barons but secured his control. He built castles, waged campaigns against rebellious lords, and gradually achieved that even the old Aquitanian families began to see him not as a foreign Angevin, but as their legitimate suzerain. Meanwhile, in England and Normandy, the struggle for influence continued. Henry the young king, still deprived of real authority, raised another rebellion, but this time without Richard's support. On the contrary, the brothers clashed with each other. Henry wanted to take Aquitaine from Richard to expand his own holdings. Richard refused to submit. In response, Henry the Young, he invaded his lands, but soon fell ill with dysentery and died at the age of 28. His death opened a new perspective for Richard. Now he became the eldest surviving son of the king, and therefore the direct heir to the entire empire. But Henry II was in no hurry to make him the official successor. He hoped to maintain control over all the lands through his youngest and, as he thought, most manageable son. Realizing that he could not wait, Richard began to strengthen ties with external allies. He swore fealty to the new King of France, Philip II Augustus, as his overlord in Normandy and Aquitaine. This step was, in essence, an open break with his father. Now Henry II found himself in a position where his own son had formed an alliance with England's chief enemy. Moreover, Richard and Philip began joint operations against English garrisons in France. This was the final act of the drama in which father and son ceased to be political allies. Meanwhile, news of the fall of Jerusalem spread across Europe. The report shocked the Christian world, and Pope Clement III called for a new, Third Crusade. Richard, a knight in spirit, a poet at heart, and a warrior by calling, was among the first to publicly vow to set out east. Perhaps this decision was driven by both religious feeling, a desire for glory, and political calculation. To become a crusader meant taking on a special status, under which all internal conflicts receded before the task of liberating the Holy Land. But before Richard could embark on his crusade, he still had one decisive battle to fight against his own father: the crown and the cross, the accession and the Third Crusade. By the early 1190s, the confrontation between Richard and his father had entered its final phase. After decades of tense relations, mutual suspicion, and political intrigue, it became clear dynastic power could no longer coexist with the personal will of each. Henry II, despite his failing health, stubbornly clung to control of the empire and avoided officially recognizing Richard as his heir. On the contrary, he encouraged his youngest son John and tried to set him against his elder brother, hoping to maintain balance through their rivalry. Richard, realizing there was no other path to power, allied with Philip II, the young and energetic King of France, who was eager to weaken England's influence on the continent. Richard swore vassalage to Philip for Normandy and Aquitaine, an act that was almost treason from the perspective of the English crown, but politically precise and well calculated. Joint military actions by the two allies forced Henry II to retreat and sign an agreement recognizing Richard as heir. 2 days later, sick, broken, and betrayed even by his beloved John, the king died at Chinon Castle. Richard was 31 years old. He became King of England, Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Anjou, inheriting one of the largest territorial empires in Europe. But unlike his father, he did not seek constant management of this empire. His heart was turned eastward. The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, seized by Saladin, became for him a goal worthy of his sword. The idea of the crusade blended in him with personal ambition, the knightly ideal, and the pursuit of immortal glory. His coronation took place on September 3, 1189, at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was conducted in full splendor with the participation of archbishops, bishops, nobility, and knights. Richard, dressed in purple, solemnly placed the crown upon his head and pronounced the oaths befitting a Christian king. But the day was remembered not only for its grandeur. On the eve of the ceremony, Richard ordered that Jews be excluded from the celebration, fearing accusations of sympathy for the killers of Christ. Nevertheless, several members of the Jewish community arrived with gifts and were roughly expelled. The next day, riots broke out in London. Mobs attacked Jewish homes, killing, looting, and burning. Richard, upon hearing this, ordered an end to the violence and punishment of the instigators, but the unrest spread to other cities as well. This cast a dark shadow over the beginning of his reign. Almost immediately after his coronation, Richard officially confirmed his intention to take part in the Third Crusade. His ally remained Philip II, while the third participant was to be the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who had already set out on the march. However, Frederick soon drowned while crossing a river in Asia Minor, and his army disbanded. Thus, the main burden of the crusade fell upon Richard and Philip. Preparing for war required enormous resources. Richard sold everything that could bring in money: lands, offices, titles, town charters. According to contemporaries, he even joked that he would have sold London itself if he had found a buyer. The main source of funding became the so-called Saladin tithe, a tax obligating all subjects of the king, including the clergy, to give 1/10 of their income for the needs of the Holy Land. These measures caused discontent but proved highly effective. Richard's army became one of the strongest and best equipped in the history of the Crusades. As regent of England during his absence, Richard appointed William Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, a loyal but unpopular figure. He also demanded that his younger brother John swear loyalty and refrain from interfering in matters of state. Yet Richard still sensed that in his absence a struggle for power might erupt in England, and thus tried to build the most solid system of control possible. In the spring of 1190, Richard left England. He crossed the Channel, visited Normandy, and moved to the southern ports of France, where his fleet was gathering. In August, he met Philip II at Vézelay, where they solemnly confirmed their alliance. Then each set out by his own route. Richard traveled to Marseilles, from where he sailed to Sicily. There he faced his first diplomatic problem. The local ruler Tancred refused to release his sister Joanna, widow of the late King William of Sicily. Moreover, the dowry owed to her had not been paid. In September, Richard seized the city of Messina, demonstrating his military power. He set up camp by the city walls, secured negotiations, and freed his sister. In gratitude, he was paid a large sum of money. However, his actions aroused the anger of the locals and tension between the allies. Philip, disapproving of the capture of Messina, soon departed for the Holy Land on his own. Richard remained in Sicily until the spring of 1191, after which he set sail. Along the way, his fleet was struck by a storm, and some ships were driven onto the shores of Cyprus. The local ruler, the usurper Isaac Komnenos, offered no aid to the shipwrecked. This became the pretext for a swift military campaign. Richard landed on the island, defeated the forces, captured the ruler, and took Cyprus under his control. The island became an important supply base and rear for his army. On Cyprus, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre. Although little is known of any love between them, the marriage was politically advantageous. It strengthened his alliance with Navarre and provided him with a worthy queen. Yet Berengaria never came to England and played no role in her husband's politics. In early June, Richard left Cyprus and headed for Acre, a city besieged by crusaders who held Muslim garrisons inside. There Philip and many European warriors were already waiting for him. Ahead of Richard lay battles that would make his name famous for centuries. When Richard's fleet approached the shores of the Holy Land, the siege of Acre had already lasted for almost 2 years. The city, the most important port of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was held by a Muslim garrison. Yet the Crusaders, who had gathered from all across Europe, had been unable to take it. The French king had already arrived earlier. His army camped before the walls, but the siege dragged on. The camp was stricken by disease, scorched by heat, and weakened by the lack of unified command. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart, well prepared and with a battle-ready army, brought new order and determination into the besieging ranks. In the first days after landing, Richard focused on strengthening the camp's defenses, organizing supplies, and scouting enemy positions. He personally inspected the surroundings, issued orders for the construction of new siege engines, maintained discipline in the army, and swiftly brought it into full combat readiness. His troops, English, Norman, and mercenary detachments, were well-trained and obedient. Their presence boosted the morale of all the Christian forces. Philip II, sensing that Richard's arrival diminished his own prominence, soon withdrew from active participation in the siege. After a few weeks of formal cooperation, he departed for France, leaving behind a small contingent under the Duke of Burgundy. Thus command passed into Richard's hands, and it was he who had to complete the operation. Richard acted energetically. He repaired and reinforced the siege works, restored the trebuchets, and built new towers. Under his command, the catapults bombarded the walls daily, while miners dug tunnels under the towers, shielded by pavises and archers. Richard himself often appeared at the front, spoke with engineers, and even helped aim the siege engines. Chroniclers note that his personal involvement inspired confidence in common soldiers and gave courage to the knights. The siege advanced slowly but steadily. By early July, Acre's walls began to collapse. The defenders, losing hope of relief, offered to surrender. According to the terms, they were to hand over the city, return the relic of the true cross, release about 1,500 Christian prisoners, and pay a large ransom. In return, Richard was to spare the garrison. The city capitulated on July 12, 1191. Saladin, encamped nearby with the bulk of his forces, confirmed the agreement, but delayed its fulfillment. For over a month, he failed to release the captives, pay the ransom, or return the relic. Richard sent envoys and extended deadlines, but by the end of August his patience ran out. In full view of the city walls, where Saladin himself could witness it, Richard ordered the execution of about 3,000 Muslim prisoners. It was meant as a show of resolve. The king believed that Saladin's failure to honor the treaty undermined trust in future negotiations and damaged the authority of the Christian host. The mass execution, carried out publicly and in an organized manner, horrified many and drew criticism from allies, but Richard stood firm in his decision. After Acre's fall, Richard did not linger. He left a garrison, secured supplies, and began preparing to march along the coast toward Jaffa. This route was carefully chosen. Advancing along the shoreline allowed naval support and avoided a deep push inland, where Saladin's army could force less favorable battles. On September 7th, as the Crusaders marched in battle formation through the wooded lands between Caesarea and Arsuf, Saladin struck. His army fell upon the rearguard with arrows, shouts, and swift cavalry raids. The Muslim horsemen attacked, vanished, and returned again, seeking to disrupt the Christian columns. But Richard had prepared his commanders. Infantry marched in tight ranks, knights were ready to counter charges, and crossbowmen covered the flanks. Richard held his men steady, refusing to be drawn into a reckless skirmish. When the pressure intensified and the Templars, acting on their own, launched a counterattack, Richard did not stop them. Seeing the opportunity, he ordered a general advance. At the center, he personally led the cavalry in a decisive charge. The impact was devastating. Saladin's forces wavered, tried to regroup, but under the crushing weight of heavy cavalry they began to retreat. The fields of Arsuf were strewn with the bodies of the fallen. For the first time in the campaign, the Crusaders had won a clear and decisive victory in open battle. The Battle of Arsuf was a turning point. It proved that the Christian army could fight with discipline, endure assaults, and strike back effectively. The victory raised morale, cemented Richard's position as the undisputed leader of the crusade, and provided a new strategic foothold. The city of Jaffa, where the army soon arrived. There Richard spent several weeks, fortifying defenses, securing supplies, and preparing for the next stage, the march on Jerusalem. Yet before setting out, Richard had to recognize a harsh truth. Victory on the battlefield was not always enough to achieve the ultimate goal. Ahead lay not only more battles but also the hardest negotiations, because across the desert stood a ruler unbroken by defeat, and too shrewd to risk another reckless fight. Saladin and Richard, enemies with respect. After the victory at Arsuf and the capture of Jaffa, Richard the Lionheart's campaign entered a new phase. Military action gave way to a subtler, more complex struggle, diplomacy. His chief adversary remained Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in Europe as Saladin, not only commander of one of the strongest armies of the Islamic world, but also a leader whose authority stretched from Egypt to Syria. He was a seasoned general, a devout Muslim, and a politician skilled at uniting rival rulers and tribes. Despite his setback at Arsuf, Saladin was far from defeated. His army remained intact, central Palestinian fortresses stood firm, and morale was still high. He understood that although the front had stabilized, the threat of an assault on Jerusalem grew ever more real. Richard, on the other hand, saw that his army was weary, its numbers dwindling, and supplies becoming harder to secure the further they moved inland. Thus began a series of negotiations that went far beyond simple terms of peace. Unlike some Western barons, Richard treated Saladin with respect. He did not see him as a barbarian or heathen, but rather as an equal, a ruler waging war for faith and duty. This respect showed in the tone of his letters and diplomatic exchanges. There was no cursing, no malice, no arrogance. Only firmness, persistence, and recognition of a worthy opponent. Saladin reciprocated. He admired Richard's personal courage, his honesty in battle, his modest lifestyle, and his straightforwardness in negotiation. Muslim chroniclers referred to him as Malik an-Nuza, the King Knight. They noted that he ate the same food as his soldiers, endured the hardships of campaign, and did not demand luxury or comfort. Such restraint commanded respect even from enemies. Over time, a tone of what chroniclers later called mutual chivalry developed between the two. Though they never met in person, They communicated constantly through emissaries, clerics, translators, and even family members. According to legend, there was once talk of a dynastic union. Saladin supposedly proposed marrying his brother to Richard's sister Joan, and giving them Jerusalem as a shared domain. Historians, however, believe this was a later invention, absent from contemporary sources. Nonetheless, gestures of courtesy accompanied the negotiations. When Richard fell ill, likely with malaria or typhoid, Saladin sent him a physician and baskets of ice and fruit. When a Muslim commander lost his sword, Richard had it returned through intermediaries. These acts were not signs of friendship, but expressions of a code of conduct, rulers demonstrating not only strength, but also culture and honor. Meanwhile, hostilities did not cease. Richard strengthened Jaffa's defenses, launched raids, and captured some fortresses. In February 1192, he even advanced to the hills overlooking Jerusalem, from which the holy city was visible. But Richard realized that even if he captured Jerusalem, he could not hold it without strong fortifications, reliable supplies, and constant reinforcements from the sea. The papal goal of reclaiming the Holy Sepulchre receded before the harsh realities of strategy. The second approach to Jerusalem. The second advance on Jerusalem took place in the summer of the same year. Yet once again, despite pressure from knights, clergy, and allies, Richard refused to launch an attack. The decision was a difficult one. It caused discontent in the camp, arguments among commanders, but it preserved the army. Richard chose to save his strength for negotiations rather than waste it on an assault that would inevitably lead to abandoning the city afterward. Meanwhile, Saladin was reinforcing his fortresses, holding the front, and himself leaning more and more toward the necessity of peace. The Muslim forces were at their limit. Recent victories did not make up for all the losses, and resources were dwindling. He needed to keep Jerusalem, but he also understood that if no agreement was reached, a new invasion and a new assault would follow. In September, the two sides signed an agreement. It was not called a peace treaty, but it effectively meant the end of the war. The coastal cities from Jaffa to Tyre remained under Christian control. Jerusalem stayed in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims were granted free access to the holy sites. The truce was concluded for a period of 3 years and 8 months. Chronicles tell that after the treaty was signed, Saladin and Richard once again exchanged gifts. One sent a hunting falcon to the other's camp, the other sent a silk robe. They never saw each other face to face, but each knew he had dealt with a worthy opponent. Their relationship became a symbol not only of military struggle but also of a rare example of mutual respect between enemies, remembered both in the East and in the West. Thus ended one of the most famous episodes of the Third Crusade. The war brought neither decisive victory nor final defeat, but it left behind the image of two men, not just warriors, but rulers who understood the price of peace and the meaning of honor. The road home and captivity, adventures and imprisonment in Austria. When Richard left the shores of the Holy Land, he left behind not only battles, camps, sieges, and diplomatic negotiations, but also years that had changed both his destiny and the face of Europe. He departed Jaffa with the sense of duty fulfilled. Though Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the honor of the cross had been preserved, the coastline fortified, and pilgrims guaranteed access to the holy places. Now the king had to return home, to an empire he had not seen for nearly 4 years, where enemies were already raising their heads and where his name had become a symbol either of hope or of threat, depending on whom the people spoke with. He set out by sea, but a violent storm scattered his escort, and the ship carrying the king was thrown onto the Adriatic coast, near lands belonging to the Babenbergs, Dukes of Austria. With one of them, Leopold I, Richard already had a quarrel long remembered by both sides. During the siege of Acre, after the city's surrender, Leopold had planted his banner beside the royal standards, which Richard took as an act of vanity. By Richard's order, the Austrian flag had been torn down and thrown from the tower. For the proud duke, it was a public humiliation that he never forgave. Aware of the danger, Richard did not attempt to cross Europe openly with royal insignia. Disguised as a merchant and under a false name, he made his way toward the German Empire, hoping to pass unnoticed. But the journey ended in disaster. At the end of December, he was recognized. According to one legend, his servant, unable to hide courtly habits, aroused suspicion by purchasing an expensive glove or a belt too fine for a merchant. Whatever the case, Richard was seized by Leopold's men and imprisoned in Dürnstein Castle, a grim fortress perched on a rock above the Danube. From that moment, his fate lay in enemy hands. The Duke of Austria had no legal right to detain a king, but soon he handed the captive over to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. Hostile to Anglo-Norman influence in Europe and eager to strengthen his own position, the emperor saw in Richard not only a valuable political hostage but also a source of enormous ransom. The capture of Richard was a sensation. News spread quickly across Europe, causing alarm in England, jubilation in France, and excitement at the court of John Lackland. Richard's younger brother, who had long coveted the crown, wasted no time in showing his intentions. He began negotiations with Philip II of France, hoping with his support to seize power. From France came proposals to the emperor, urging him to keep Richard in custody as long as possible, in return for gold and political concessions. England was plunged into political crisis. The regents appointed by Richard were losing authority, the barons hesitated, and the people grew restless. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the king's mother, immediately entered the struggle. Despite her age, she energetically engaged in negotiations, writing letters to Rome, to the emperor, and to Pope Celestine II, arguing that the arrest of a Christian king was sacrilege, violating church law. The Pope listened and excommunicated Duke Leopold for his role in Richard's capture, but this did not change the prisoner's situation. Meanwhile, Emperor Henry VI demanded a ransom of 100,000 marks of pure silver, about 3 years of the English crown's income. A second installment was also stipulated in case of delay or political concessions. Raising such a sum was a colossal task. In England, a special tax was levied. Churches gave up their chalices, monasteries donated treasures, and common folk contributed silver coins and ornaments. The country, already exhausted by crusade taxes, now paid again, but this time to free its king. Richard spent nearly a year and a half in captivity, first in Dürnstein, then in Trifles Castle. His conditions were neither the harshest nor the most privileged. He lived under guard without freedom of correspondence, but, according to some chroniclers, he kept his spirits high. Rumors spread that he composed songs in Occitan, and one tale tells how his loyal troubadour Blondel, searching for his master, sang familiar melodies outside every castle until Richard himself responded. The story became a romantic symbol of loyalty, though historians consider it a later literary invention without documentary proof. By the spring of 1194, most of the ransom had been gathered. Satisfied, the emperor agreed to release his prisoner. On February 4th, Richard was freed and, accompanied by his retainers, headed for England. He crossed France under escort, reunited with his mother, and in March arrived in England, where he was welcomed with relief and joy. The regalia were immediately restored to him. He confirmed his rights to the throne, convened a council, and prepared for the next stage of his life. But his return home was not the end of his troubles. His brother, who had sought to usurp power, awaited him. The King of France, with whom a new war was now inevitable, awaited him. And Richard himself, who had gone from coronation to captivity, would have to prove once more that the name Lionheart belonged not only to legend, but to a living man, able to hold the crown on the edge of a sword. Return and new wars, the final years of rule. When Richard the Lionheart set foot on English soil, he was greeted not only with joy but also with unease. The kingdom awaited its king, but did not know in what form he would return, as a weary prisoner or as a commanding sovereign. He landed at Portsmouth in early March and almost immediately traveled to Winchester, where his second coronation took place. This act, more symbolic than political, was necessary to emphasize the continuity of legitimacy and to show that, despite his captivity, royal authority had never been broken. Yet Richard did not linger in England. He remained in the realm for only a few weeks, during which he confirmed his claim to the throne, convened the barons, appointed loyal men to key posts, and punished traitors with heavy fines. His brother John, involved in conspiracy and ready to usurp power, was publicly pardoned for political reasons but stripped of any real influence. Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, continued to play an important role in governance, especially in the southern provinces where her authority remained unshaken. The king's main concern once again became France. In May 1194, he left England, crossed the Channel, and soon arrived in Normandy, where a bitter and protracted struggle with King Philip II of France was already underway. During Richard's captivity, the French crown had consolidated its position, seized several key cities, and won the support of some Angevin barons. The struggle, which had begun as a defense of the Plantagenet legacy, was now turning into a full-scale war for political balance in Western Europe. Richard once again proved that he had forgotten neither strategic thinking nor the knightly spirit. He personally led campaigns, reinforced garrisons, forged temporary alliances, and, when necessary, struck unexpected blows at the enemy's rear. Under his leadership, diplomacy flourished. Envoys were sent to the Dukes of Brittany, the Counts of Toulouse, and even the German Emperor to secure either support or neutrality. Throughout the conflict, he demonstrated remarkable endurance and clarity of purpose. To hold Normandy, to recover Anjou and Maine, and to prevent Philip from driving the English off the continent altogether. One of the main symbols of this struggle became Château Gallard, the Merry Castle, as the English themselves called it. Construction began in 1196 and was completed 2 years later. Built on a cliff above the Seine in a strategically vital location between Rouen and the French royal frontier, it became not merely a fortress but a direct challenge to Philip. Richard personally oversaw construction, chose the site, approved the designs, and, according to chroniclers, visited the site daily. He invested in the project not only royal funds but also his reputation. Château Gallard was meant to be a bastion that would not only halt the enemy but also demonstrate that the English were on the continent to stay. The castle incorporated the most advanced defensive ideas of its age. A complex system of walls, concentric defenses, inner bastions, moats, and stone bridges. It was the first case in Western Europe where fortress architecture was so thoroughly designed for military purposes. Its construction was enormously costly, but Richard considered it essential. One day he exclaimed, "If the walls were made of butter, I would still hold them." Chroniclers recorded the phrase, and it later became a symbol of his determination. Parallel to war and construction, Richard pursued an active internal policy. He redistributed lands, strengthened ties with vassals, restored church rights, and controlled trade. In Normandy, he established judicial commissions to eliminate abuses. He also reformed taxation in his French dominions to ensure the financing of war. Although he had no heirs, he was building a system capable of ensuring the continuity of power. Eleanor remained his chief confidant in the southern part of the empire. By 1198, Richard had regained most of the territories lost during his captivity. Philip II suffered several defeats, was forced to retreat, and to sign temporary agreements, but Richard had no intention of stopping. He knew that final victory required not only battles but also the suppression of internal resistance. In the spring of 1199, he launched a small campaign in Limousin, where one of the local barons, Aymar of Calas-Chabrol, had refused to recognize royal authority and fortified himself in his castle. Rumors claimed a great treasure was hidden in the castle walls, and Richard, expecting a quick and profitable operation, arrived with limited forces. He anticipated no serious resistance. Yet the siege dragged on, and on March 26th, while inspecting the lines, the king was struck by a crossbow bolt. This event marked the beginning of the story to be told in the next chapter. The final act of a man whose heart belonged not to the throne but to the battlefield. The death of the king and the immortality of the myth. The siege of Calas-Chabrol in Aquitaine began as a local punitive expedition against a rebellious vassal. King Richard, in the midst of his long struggle with the King of France, sought to stamp out resistance and seize the rumored treasure hidden within the fortress. On March 26th, during an evening inspection, Richard, as often, was near the front lines with little guard or escort. From the walls of the castle, a crossbowman fired a bolt that struck the king in the left shoulder. At first, the wound seemed minor. The king did not lose consciousness, remained composed, and even allowed treatment without delay. Yet during extraction, the royal surgeon inflicted further damage, and soon the wound turned septic. Gangrene set in. Richard was carried to a tent, where his condition worsened steadily. As swelling and fever increased, Richard realized the inevitability of the outcome. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, hastened to his side. Despite her advanced age, she spent her son's final days with him, listening to his commands, comforting him, and staying until the end. According to chroniclers, the king retained clarity of mind until the very last. He made his will, appointed his younger brother John as heir, and ordered the pardon of the crossbowman who had shot him. The archer's name, preserved in the chronicles, was Pierre Basile, a youth who had acted on his own, without his lord's command. Richard, learning this, supposedly said, "Let him go. He has fulfilled God's will." But after the king's death, the siege commander ordered Pierre's brutal execution despite Richard's pardon. Richard died on the evening of April 6, 1199, 11 days after the wound. His last words, spoken to his mother, were reportedly, "Do not weep, mother, for I die as a king." Whether legend or truth, the phrase deeply entered the image of a monarch who met death with dignity. Richard's body was buried in parts, according to his wishes. His heart, symbolizing loyalty to Normandy, was sent to Rouen, capital of his continental domains, and enshrined in a silver reliquary in the cathedral. His entrails remained at Calas, marking the place where his life had ended. His body was carried to the Abbey of Fontevraud, laid beside his father and later his mother. There, in the monastery's main hall, the tombs of father and son were set side by side, reunited in death. Though Richard's reign had been filled with political and personal strife, his death was of great historical consequence. His brother John Lackland, who succeeded him, was weaker, less decisive, and unable to hold together the vast Anglo-French empire built by Henry II and reinforced by Richard. Within only a few years of the Lionheart's death, most of the continental territories had passed to the French crown. Richard's passing symbolically marked the end of an age, knightly, impulsive, based on personal bravery and the authority of the individual. But his memory did not vanish with his death. Already in the 13th century, troubadours sang ballads of the Crusader king. Chroniclers fashioned a romantic image of the warrior, poet, and just ruler. One of the most beloved legends was that of the faithful minstrel Blondel, who, searching for the captive king, sang their shared song beneath castle towers until Richard's voice answered back. Though almost certainly invented, the tale became part of the Richard legend, the king who could never be forgotten. In English memory, Richard endured as the embodiment of the knightly ideal, strong, generous, and brave. Despite spending most of his reign abroad, seldom visiting England, his figure was celebrated as a symbol of national greatness. His image was invoked in art, literature, and even politics, presented as the model of royal courage. Through the centuries, Richard's body lay quietly at Fontevraud, but his heart became an object of reverence. In the 19th century, during restoration of Rouen Cathedral, his reliquary was opened, revealing a dried but preserved heart surrounded by incense, frankincense, vegetal remains, and silver dust, prepared in the same manner as Christian martyrs. Scholars confirmed the authenticity, and once again Richard's name was spoken not merely as a ruler, but as a legend. Thus ended the life of Richard I, the Lionheart, a man whose destiny bound together poetry and politics, cruelty and generosity, victories and defeats. He did not die in open battle, but with weapon in hand, remaining true to himself until his last breath. His throne passed to his brother, but his name endured through the centuries, an echo of an age when the sword outweighed the crown, and a king's word was stronger than walls.